Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 14. Gone. Sarah usually was a very rational and collected person. She was confident in herself and her abilities, and was used to working under pressure. Stress usually even helped her to be more efficient. Tonight, however, it was all getting too much, and for almost the first time in her life, Sarah Alder found herself unable to form a single clear thought. Instead, she was caught in a spiral of self-hatred and blame. She was still standing at the crime scene, her eyes focused on the young woman lying on the ground right in front of her, the young woman who had lost her life because of her. Sarah kneeled down next to her and gently closed her eyes with her gloved hand. Why did Libba have to die? Well, she knew exactly why. The more important question was, how could she have let this happen? She had been weak, foolish, had allowed herself to feel, had gotten distracted, had stopped being careful and had completely lost her focus. And all because of Detective Tally Craven and her way of driving Sarah completely crazy. No, she stopped herself right there and then. This had not been Craven's fault. This was on her and her alone. She recalled the conversation she had with her partner only a couple of minutes ago, and was already starting to regret what she had said to the younger woman. She knew her words had been hard, but they had also been necessary. Necessary for Craven, because she needed to get away from Sarah at all costs, even if this meant she would hate Sarah. Anything else was just too dangerous, but also necessary for Sarah herself, because she had needed to say out loud, to fully understand what her mind had been screaming at her for weeks now. There is no us, and there never will be. These were the facts that she had to accept, no matter how much her heart was trying to deny them. Still, she realized now that her behavior towards Craven had been not entirely fair. She had acted irrationally, had used her partner to fuel her self-hatred even further. The look on Craven's face, the hurt and utter disappointment, had definitely done just that. But Craven wasn't her emotional punching bag. She did not deserve to get dragged into this even further, and Sarah guiltily realized that she was definitely owing her partner an apology. So she lifted her head and looked around, hoping to spot a familiar red shock of hair in the bustle of people around her. But no matter how hard she tried, Sarah couldn't spot Craven anywhere. Had she upset the younger woman so much that she had already left? That didn't sound like Craven at all. She frowned in confusion and walked over to Nikta, who was standing a couple of feet away. Have you seen Craven? She couldn't hide the trace of worry in her voice. Not since she ran after you, Nikta raised her eyebrow, a flash of concern ghosting over her face when she spotted Sarah's uncertainty. Everything all right? You mean apart from the fact that this young woman over there is dead because I couldn't keep it in my pants? Sarah replied bitterly. Sarah, can you please stop with this bullshit? You know that's not what I meant, and this constant self-loathing won't bring you anywhere. I wanted to know if everything is all right between you and Craven. You look concerned. Sarah exhaled quietly and forced herself to keep her face as neutral as possible. She would definitely not tell Nikta about their argument, and she was in absolutely no mood for more discussions with her. None of your business. Then she simply turned around and started to walk away. Good talk, Sarah. We should do this more often. Nicta grumbled behind her, but Sarah didn't have time for this now and ignored her. Her main priority was to find Craven and apologize for the way she had handled things earlier. She headed towards 2 young cops who were standing a bit away from the old shed. "Has either of you seen Detective Craven?" Both immediately stopped their conversation and looked at Sarah with big eyes, seemingly unable to reply to her and completely intimidated by her presence alone. She was used to this kind of behavior by now, but still couldn't help and roll her eyes. "Did you not hear me?" That seemed to do the trick, and one of the cops quickly shook his head. The other one, however, actually nodded. "Your partner? I've seen her walk over to the old fabric building over there. I thought it was a bit weird that she was walking around completely on her own, that far from the crime scene. But that was almost an hour ago." Sarah paused, and the uneasy feeling in her stomach was growing stronger. "Have you seen her come out again?" The cop hesitated. "No," he replied, and when he spotted the expression on Sarah's face, carefully stepped away from her. Sarah felt a wave of rage rushing through her body. "You're telling me you stood here the entire time, watched Detective Craven walk inside an abandoned building on her own in the middle of the night, and didn't even bother to check on her when she wasn't coming out again? What sort of cop even are you?" She didn't wait for a reply and stormed off, back to Nicta, who was mustering her confused concern now clearly written all over her face. Sarah still couldn't believe the incompetence of the cop she had talked to. She grabbed a flashlight and then Nicta's elbow and wordlessly dragged her towards the old building. Nicta didn't even have time to protest or ask any questions, and only stumbled after her. Sarah only slowed down right in front of the abandoned building and carefully opened the door. After she had quietly stepped inside, hearing Nicta following right behind her, she paused and looked around. At first glance, it looked like nobody had been in here in ages, but then she noticed the purposely smudged footsteps in the dust that were leading up the stairs. It looked like somebody had been trying to cover up their tracks, which could only mean one thing. Something here was going terribly wrong. Something that definitely involved Craven. Her breath hitched and her shoulders dropped slightly. Then she felt Nicta's hand on her arm, and when she turned around, recognized the silent question on her face. "What exactly are we doing here?" Sarah nodded towards the smudged floor, then muttered a single word under her breath. "Craven." It was all it took, and understanding flashed over Nicta's face as she grabbed her weapon and got into position behind Sarah to cover her back. Sometimes it was almost scary to see how well she still knew Sarah, and how few words they needed to communicate with each other. Sometimes Sarah almost regretted that Nicta was no longer part of her life. Sometimes she truly missed her as a friend, not that she would ever admit this out loud. Together they carefully followed the footsteps up the stairs, weapons drawn and on high alert. Even with the bright flashlight, it was difficult to see much in the dark, and Sarah half expected someone to jump at them from one of the many dark corners. She stayed on high alert, each muscle of her body tense, prepared for an attack. But there were no sudden movements, and everything stayed silent. Too silent. If Craven had been in here, she definitely wasn't anymore. Or, and Sarah did her best to push that thought into the furthest corner of her mind, she was no longer able to make any sound. The first floor looked just as abandoned as the ground floor, and Sarah was starting to believe that maybe that cop from earlier had simply missed Craven leaving the building again. He didn't seem to be all that attentive after all. In her head, she was already making up the lecture she would give Tally about following leads without any backup, kept imagining the slightest annoyed look on Craven's face and the way she would be rolling her eyes at her. She was repeating the words she would say to her in her head over and over again like a mantra, and somehow it was actually helping her to stay calm. But then they entered the room to the right of the stairs, and it only took a second for her carefully constructed imagination, for her hopes and her made-up sense of security to fall apart, when she spotted a large bundle lying under the window. A bundle that even in the dim light looked a lot like a person. "Craven?" A breathless whisper. Then her body was moving on its own accord as it rushed forward. Before she could stop herself, her voice turned into a desperate scream. "Tally? Oh my God, Tally!" But it wasn't her partner lying on the ground. It was only her coat that had been draped on the ground. For a split second, Sarah was relieved, but then she turned her head and could feel her whole body going cold. Next to the coat, a single word was written in capital letters into the dust on the ground. Mine. Then Sarah spotted the small golden medal that was lying right next below the words. The message was crystal clear. He had her. The Camarilla killer has Tally, and there was absolutely nothing Sarah could do about it. Sarah Alder didn't cry when she dropped onto her knees. She didn't cry when she buried her face in Tally's coat. Alder didn't cry when she felt Nicta kneeling down next to her, carefully placing her arm around her shoulder in an attempt to pull her back onto her feet. She was about to protest, couldn't understand why Nicta not simply would let her grieve. But then she spotted the pained expression on her former partner's face that was paired with a small glimmer in her eyes, something that almost looked like hope. Nicta, let me... Sarah, I care about her too, you know. Other than Sarah, Nicta was not able to stop a small sob from escaping her, but she quickly managed to regain control over her voice. But she is not dead yet, and the best thing we can do to help her is to leave this crime scene untouched and get forensics over here as soon as possible. The Camarilla killer clearly left in a hurry. Maybe they will find something. This is our chance. Sarah really didn't like the sound of that. Tally was gone. She might still be alive, but she is in grave danger. How could Nicta see any of this as a chance? She was about to open her mouth in protest, but once again, Nicta seemed to sense what she was about to say and tightened her grip around her, turning her body slightly more towards Sarah. You know that I do not mean it like that. You can't help Craven if you sit here all night and lose yourself in self-hatred. Someone once said to me that you cannot go back in time and change what has already happened. So the only thing you have left is moving forward. Sarah remembered the words all too well. She had said them to Nicta back in the days when they both barely knew each other and had just started working as detectives. Nicta had almost messed up her first homicide, and Sarah had found her sobbing on the toilet. Even then, she had not been much of a people person, but seeing Nicta like that had somehow felt a bit too relatable. They had spent the entire night drinking away their worries, which had been the start of their friendship. A bittersweet memory that was now almost enough to make Sarah smile. Almost. Still, Nicta's words were enough to finally get Sarah out of her state of shock, and she allowed her former partner to lead her away from the window and out of the building, into the cold night. Sarah Alder didn't cry when Nicta left her alone for a moment. Adrenaline was still pumping through her body, and she couldn't form a clear thought. She watched forensics and a handful of cops enter the building, but couldn't quite process any of it. It felt like she was watching a movie through a screen. She just wished there was a way for her to turn it off. Sarah Alder didn't cry when Petra Bellwether walked over to her a few minutes later and gently touched her shoulder. Petra's eyes, which were usually stern and always professional, were now filled with something that Sarah knew all too well. Misery, pity, grief. When Petra opened her mouth to speak, Sarah Alder knew what was coming next. She'd been here before, after all. Still, Petra's words, no matter how carefully phrased, stung and did absolutely nothing to ease the pain inside of her. Sarah, you know I can't let you stay here. Not like this. You are too close, and in absolutely no state to make any rational decisions in this case. She didn't even try to argue. All she had left to offer was a tired nod. Then, Sarah wordlessly turned around and slowly walked away from Petra, away from the crime scene, away from the place where Tally Craven had been taken away from her, but not away from her nagging guilt. Sarah Alder didn't cry when she finally made it back to the car, and the first thing she saw as she opened the door was Tally's scarf, which was still lying on the passenger seat. She sat down behind her steering wheel and forced herself to take a deep breath. For probably the first time in her entire life, she had absolutely no idea what to do with herself. Deep down, she knew that Petra was right. No matter how desperate she was, no matter how much she wanted to help, she couldn't just barge into the station and bury herself in work. All that was waiting for her there were the case files, and these were completely useless. It was not like Tally's kidnapping would magically let appear evidence that had not been there before, and that would lead her directly to her partner. This wasn't a fairy tale. In fact, this has rather turned around into Sarah's personal nightmare, one she couldn't just simply wake up from. She could feel herself spiraling again. It was moments like these in which Sarah realized how much she had gotten used to Tally's calming presence around her, how much she had started to rely on the support of the younger woman. But all that Sarah seemed to have left was to shift her own perspective instead. What would Tally do? The realization came surprisingly quick. Tally would, for starters, not make all of this about herself. Sarah's bitter voice practically screamed at her. Tally would ask herself what Sarah would need, what she would do to help her. So, what would Tally want her to do? She paused for a moment and suddenly knew where she needed to be. She started to drive. Sarah Alder didn't cry when she stepped out of the car and was hit by pouring rain. It was almost ironic how the weather seemed to capture her mood just perfectly. Her jacket was still lying somewhere at the crime scene, and she was only wearing a thin shirt. So when she finally made it to her destination, an apartment all the way down the street, she was completely soaked, and her cold fingers were shaking when she pressed the doorbell. Even though it was already way past midnight, it didn't take long for the door to open. Sarah could hear someone walking down the hallway, and she was greeted by a relieved voice, even before someone was actually stepping outside. "Tally, is that you? Did you lose your keys? And why didn't you reply to any of our texts? We were..." "Oh. What are you doing here?" Sarah Alder didn't cry when Abigail Bellwether stopped her rambling and stared at her in utter confusion. She hadn't exactly thought this through, and didn't quite know what to say. When Sarah didn't reply immediately, the young detective mustered her face and froze. Did something happen? Sarah's reply came almost automatically this time. She was speaking slowly and her voice sounded completely hollow. "He has her. The Camarilla killer has Tally, and it's completely my fault." Sarah could no longer hide her pain, and her last words were barely more than a whisper. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, Detective Bellwether only stared at her, obviously still processing what Sarah had just said. Then she slowly watched her expression on the younger woman's face change. Confusion, understanding, terror. A single strangled word left the detective's lips. "No." "I thought you should hear it from me, not anybody else. You're her family. She would have wanted me to tell you. So I came here. I can understand that I'm probably the last person that you want to see right now, but I had to do this." When Detective Bellwether still didn't manage a proper reply and stayed silent, Sarah felt her shoulders drop, and resignation washed over her. I'm sorry. This was a mistake. I'll just leave." She was already about to turn around when Bellwether finally seemed to come to her senses. "Wait." She sounded much softer than Sarah would have expected, almost as if she was not only concerned about Tally, but about Sarah as well. "I am completely overwhelmed with everything that is going on right now, but you are completely soaked and your whole body is trembling. Please, come in. Let's warm you up, and then you tell us what the fuck happened." Sarah Alder didn't cry when she stepped inside the apartment and watched how Abigail Bellwether wrapped her arms around a sobbing blonde woman who had apparently been standing in the hallway the entire time. Raelle Collar, Sarah remembered. Sarah only stood there, awkwardly, her gaze averted, feeling like an intruder during this clearly very private moment. Then Bellwether finally seemed to remember her presence. She released her grasp around Raelle and cleared her throat, then looked back at Alder. Through tear-clouded eyes. "We need to get you out of these clothes." She turned around and walked towards what Sarah assumed was one of the bedrooms. Raelle stayed with her, but neither of the two women really knew what to say to each other, so they remained silent. Still, Sarah could feel the piercing gaze of the blonde woman on her the entire time, mustering her carefully. She was glad when Bellwether finally returned and put a stop to the silence between them. The detective had a set of clothes in her hands, a simple sweater and a pair of leggings, and handed both over to Sarah with an apologetic smile. "Sorry, that's all I could find. She paused and gulped, visibly trying to push down her tears. "It's Tally's. You're about the same size. My things will probably be too big and Rael's too small. I'm sure she wouldn't mind." Sarah only nodded and sent a small, grateful smile her way. Then she wordlessly took the clothes from the other woman. Bellwether pointed towards the bathroom and Sarah left to get changed. Sarah Alder didn't cry when she was putting on the clothes and was immediately hit by a scent that was so unmistakably Tally that when she closed her eyes, she could practically feel her partner standing next to her. She allowed herself a moment of quiet and inhaled deeply, letting Tally's scent fill her senses. It calmed her down immediately, but the moment was over far too quickly, and when she opened her eyes again, she found herself still alone in the bathroom, Tally nowhere to be seen. A tired sigh escaped her when she realized there truly was no turning back from this now. Then Sarah forced herself to straighten her back and walked out of the bathroom. She followed the sound of the voices she heard from the hallway and found Bellwether and Rael sitting at the table in the living room, with 3 cups of tea and 3 glasses of something that looked a suspicious lot like whiskey placed in front of them. Under different circumstances, Alder would have chuckled at this gesture. Petra definitely taught her daughter well. Her gaze must have lingered a bit too long over the beverage because Bellwether noticed. The corners of her mouth twisted into a tiny smile and she shrugged. "Figured we could all use something stronger?" "I really appreciate it. Thank you." Then Sarah sat down next to the 2 women, and after she downed her whiskey in one go, didn't waste any more time and started to give them an overview of what exactly had happened at the crime scene. She purposefully left out the fact that Tally had almost kissed her right before Nicta had called them, and only said that they had an argument. She figured that Tally had probably been telling them almost everything that has happened between them, but she was definitely not putting herself through the misery of admitting her own feelings for Tally out loud. Sarah tried her best to make her voice sound passive, and kept her eyes focused on the drinks in front of her. She expected Tally's best friends to interrupt her at any moment, to yell at her, and throw her out of their apartment. It would be the least she deserved. But to her surprise, the 2 women listened to her silently. She could hear Rael gasp after she finished explaining how she and Nicta had found the written message of the Camarilla killer on the ground. And soon after, Sarah had reached the end of her report and fell silent. It was Bellwether who spoke first, her voice determined, and Sarah was almost shocked at how much she sounded like her mother. "So what can we do?" Sarah wished she could answer her with something, anything uplifting, but they had to face the truth, and that was sadly anything but uplifting. "Nothing. We can do absolutely nothing but wait." The moment of silence that followed was almost deafening. The realization that they were in fact completely powerless seemed to hit all of them, and for a while, each of the 3 women processed the conversation they just had on their own. Then Bellwether spoke again, quieter this time, but still not any less determined or sincere. "I'm not blaming you, you know." Sarah's head snapped up at her words. That was definitely not what she had expected. Her eyes grew wide and she frowned in confusion, not quite sure what to say. "I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not the biggest fan of your methods and the way you tend to treat people around you. And to be honest, when Tally started to work with you, I was more than just a bit skeptical. But she truly cares about you. And the fact that the first thing you thought about after what you've just been through was to tell us what happened because that's what Tally would have wanted, tells me that you care about her too. You care about her more deeply than you dare to admit, probably even to yourself. I know you don't want to hear it, but you didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's not your fault that Tally is gone." Sarah disagreed, at least with the last part, but she was too tired to argue. So she only smiled wryly and mumbled a quiet thank you. They felt quiet again after this, and Sarah poured herself another glass of whiskey, hoping it would somehow numb some of the pain inside her. It didn't. After a while, Rael seemed to have made a decision and raised her voice slightly. "It's not like any of us will be getting sleep tonight. But maybe we should try and get some rest? Her eyes wandered to Sarah. We don't know each other all that well, but I agree with everything that Abigail has said, and I would feel really bad for sending you home. You shouldn't be alone and drown yourself in your own sorrows all night. Plus, with the amount of whiskey you drank, there's no way you're still able to drive. So why don't you stay here? You can take the couch. You will be the first they call when there's news anyway. So Abigail and I will stay up to date as well. Normally, an offer like this would be completely out of Sarah's comfort zone, and she would rather walk home through the pouring rain than staying. But nothing about any of this was normal, and for some reason, Riel's words and the way she and Abigail were treating her with nothing but kindness really touched her. So she nodded. Only if it's not too much trouble. Sarah Alder didn't cry when she had settled down on the couch and stared at the ceiling, once more alone with her thoughts. More and more images of Tally started to fill her mind, and she could do absolutely nothing to stop it. Maybe Tally was opening her eyes at that exact moment, would look around dazed and slightly confused, until her memories would slowly come back to her. Maybe the cold grip of panic would wash over her, and she would start to scream. Would scream for help, would scream for Sarah, but Sarah wouldn't hear her, because she had let her down. Maybe Tally was already awake for hours. Maybe her screams would not be screams of panic, but screams of pain. Maybe she was currently going through things Sarah didn't even want to imagine, and Sarah couldn't help her, because she had let her down. Or maybe Tally wasn't awake at all. Maybe she would not scream. Maybe she would not even breathe anymore. Maybe Tally Craven was already dead, and Sarah would need to accept that, because she had let her down. These thoughts alone were almost enough to break her completely, but she couldn't let this happen. She needed to stay strong, for Tally. So instead of letting her mind wander, letting it panic about things she had no longer any control over, she took the little control she had left back and started to replace her fears with real, actual memories of Tally. How she had spilled that goddamn coffee all over her on the first day. Goddess, Sarah had been so annoyed by her. Had been about to murder Petra for partnering her up with someone like this. How she had enjoyed watching Tally squirm when she helped her with her shooting aim on her second day. Had been so much fun to tease her, to watch her head turn red as soon as Sarah was standing too close to her. How Tally had looked at her through these big brown eyes before her first trial. She'd been so scared and was so grateful for Sarah's advice. How Tally had returned the favor and got behind Sarah's walls for the first time, right before the press conference. Sarah had tried her best to conceal her own attraction then, had desperately tried to ignore that tingling sensation in her stomach that she felt whenever Tally was close. How Tally had asked her to dance at the ball, and, no matter how hard she was trying, Sarah couldn't fully blame her acceptance of the dance purely on the alcohol. In fact, she hadn't felt it at all during the dance. She had simply enjoyed the closeness to Tally, had allowed herself to let go. How Tally had stood in front of her door, stubborn and determined to not let Sarah go through the return of the Camarilla killer on her own. She had fully opened up to her then, more than she had to anyone since Elizabeth had died. She couldn't really explain why, but around Tally, she felt safe, felt understood, felt complete. Around Tally, she could forget. How Tally had looked at her in a mix of confusion and arousal when she had stormed into that bar. Hearing Tally flirt with Libba had made the rational part of her brain stop working. She had seen red and had stormed off so quickly that Nicta wasn't able to stop her. How Tally had driven her crazy all night without even trying. Every laugh of her, every sway of her hips, every time she had leaned in close to her, introducing her as her girlfriend had felt so natural, so real. Their dance had felt so real. How Tally's lips had felt against her own, how she had pressed her body eagerly against Sarah's, how she had gasped, how they both had finally let go and given in to their desire. Each of these memories made it harder to ignore, what Sarah was desperately trying to push away. This was more than just a quick fling, more than a simple attraction. Sarah Alder had fallen for Telly Craven. She had fallen hard. And she might never get the chance to act on these feelings. Not that she would have anyway, even without the Camarilla killer in the picture. She couldn't expect Tally to spend her life with someone like her. But just for the moment, she allowed herself to dream, to think of all the what-ifs, rather than about the fact that she was probably never going to experience any of it. Unsurprisingly, she didn't sleep all night. The sun was already rising when the ringing of her phone made her jump and yanked her out of her thoughts and back into reality. When she spotted Nicta's name on the display, her heartbeat fastened. A wave of panic shot through her, and she had to remind herself to continue breathing. With shaking hands, she finally managed to accept the call. Nicta started talking almost immediately, her voice calm and collected. They found her. She is alive. And that was when Sarah Alder finally allowed herself to cry. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.